So, I, thinking about where, where the cryptocurrency is headed and industry is headed, and like, very specifically, where exchanges are headed and what are sort of going to be, the pathways forward. Um, Exchanges sort of serve a really interesting role in the cryptocurrency industry, and they serve a really big one. And I think this is really central to where they are now and where they're going. If you look at what an exchange means in traditional finance, typically it refers pretty specifically to, a matching engine, to a place where, um, a buyer and a seller can meet to do a trade. And so, two users might ultimately trade on the New York Stock Exchange in some stock, but every other part of that process is sort of governed by different things. And so, people would be using a broker like, Schwab or Fidelity, some front end to connect to it. They'd be using, different lines ultimately to access the actual matching engine. They might be going through a bunch of intermediaries in the middle, whether it's through some aggregation, whether it's through some dark pool, whether it's through some HFT firm. Um, the trade might be passed off a few times before actually, getting ultimately printed between two parties on the order book. They're sort of totally different entities which are designing these products, which are listing them, creating them, marketing them. The customer acquisition is generally not a thing that exchanges are focused or are sort of the primary drivers of. And so, there's just a lot of different companies which are serving a lot of different pieces in that story. But when you take a look at sort of the cryptocurrency industry, exchanges are many of those at once. Like, the exchange isn't just a matching engine. It's also the risk and liquidation engine. It's the customer acquisition engine. It's the listing decisions. It's in many cases the product design and development and creation. It's the front end. It's the API. There just like aren't middlemen. And instead, many exchanges actually just serve like every role at once, involved in sort of the pipeline of a trade coming to fruition. I think that's super interesting. And it's one of the reasons that exchanges have been such a big part of the cryptocurrency space, basically from the beginning, where if you ask people to say, name the, 10 biggest things you can in crypto, probably like a third of them are going to be exchanges. Whereas if you said, like, ask people, to name the 10 biggest things in finance, I don't know, maybe one of them will be an exchange. So what that means is that instead of having, it's interesting because, it's almost a point of centralization compared to traditional finance. It's almost like more is concentrated into a few venues. And that certainly shaped what exchanges do today and what the cryptocurrency industry looks like today. I mean, customer loyalty is often, as much exchange based as it is product or ticker based or token based. And when you look at regulation is often focused on exchanges as much as everything else, which again is really in contrast to traditional finance. And so you have sort of this one point which ends up bearing the brunt of, half the customer acquisition and half the regulatory pressure and half the product development, really, of the entire space. And that's sort of, been really, really central to how crypto, has developed so far. And I guess that it will continue, at least for the kind of like near future, to be central to how it responds to external pressures. And so as you start to see consolidation in the exchange space, and we've definitely seen this, like we've definitely seen some exchanges dropping off. We've seen some revitalized and some growing. And I can say obviously I've been really excited by the growth that we've seen in FTX over the last year. But it's not the only venue that's had a good year. That looking forward, a lot of the focus on the development of the crypto industry is resting on the development of exchanges. When you think about what crypto is going to look like in the United States, which is just one of the biggest markets obviously in the world, the thing that people focus on there as much as anything else is how are exchanges going to interface with regulators, right? Like, what products are exchanges going to be able to offer in sort of in the jurisdiction to its residents, and when people think about offering derivatives in the United States, a lot of that focus is on negotiations between exchanges and regulators, and so exchanges end up as ambassadors as well for the industry in a bunch of different places. And that can be good and that can be bad. And, the bad side of this is when there's disputes between exchanges and regulators, when things don't go well, it can taint the entire industry and how people view it. And on the flip side, it also can mean that, like, ideally, not every single token, every single product has to separately figure out how to fit within regulatory frameworks and how to interface with regulators. If exchanges can take the lead on that, then they can do that on behalf of all of their listings. And so I think, as we look forward to 2021, one of the big things that I'm going to be looking for is, what do relationships between exchanges and regulators look like, particularly in the United States, in China, in Japan, and in Korea, and a few other venues where there's huge potential for the industry. And I think that will end up just having large impacts on how the industry overall develops. So that's I think one of the key things that I'm looking for. And I'm optimistic that those will go well. I'm optimistic that there's going to be good developments, and that basically exchanges and regulators are going to come to a good place in terms of how to deal with each other. But that's not guaranteed, and I think that's going to be one of the big things to look at. And when you start to look at growth of the industry, I think you see possibly a similar thing, where so much of the growth so far has been driven by a few products and a few exchanges, and that's how customer acquisition has worked. And for other products, it's gone through exchanges. And often the food chain there is Bitcoin attracts users to crypto that then in turn get attracted to one of a few different exchanges, and then to other products on those exchanges. And that funnel has been huge, and it might continue, but I also expect to see other venues and an increasing diversity of those. And I think particularly, as more mainstream institutions start to kind of dip their toes into the water here and start to look into getting into crypto, we've obviously seen that having huge impact on Bitcoin particularly. And I think that we're going to start to see that in other coins as well. And we're going to start to see those being entry points, right? And so if, like, PayPal isn't really an exchange right now, maybe that'll change. But it is obviously a huge potential entry point for users into the space and for user acquisition and growth. And we may, same with GBTC. And we may see more of this. And I think that's going to lead to more white labeling. I think it's going to lead to more growth of the industry. I think it's going to lead to a more diverse set of customer acquisition tools, with less of that falling on exchanges in percentage terms than sort of historically has. And I think that that means that there's going to be less, more focus on the product and less on the branding of exchanges, at least as far as public facing things are concerned, on the margin. Although, if we do see growth of the industry, I think that's going to mean growth of all of these things. And so, on an absolute scale, you might see growth in just every metric there. Um, and so, I think that's sort of another trend, which I don't know, but if I had to guess, I would guess we'll see something like that. Um, and then I, I think finally, as we look forward to 2021, I think that there's going to be a lot of eyes on, and a lot of eyes on Bitcoin and Bitcoin performance and just purely that. But there's also going to be a lot of eyes on what is crypto, on people trying to figure out what this thing is, how to reckon with it, how to think about it. And, I think in a lot of people's minds, it's still to be determined whether crypto is basically, um, a thing you can gamble on and buy and sell, whether it's a payment rail, whether it's meant to be some decentralized ecosystem, whether it's a way to store your wealth in sort of a private manner, whether it's some large decentralized computation engine, whether it's a way to easily create fractional bits of things, or something else altogether, or all of those. And of course, part of the answer is that it is all of those, and that there are a lot of sides to crypto and a lot of things it can mean. But uh, also part of the answer is that the world is still trying to figure out exactly what long term it's going to think of crypto as, and especially people who have sort of been on the outskirts for a lot of the time, and have been paying some attention, but not really tuned in, but I might be doing so over the next year, as again we start to see bits of sort of the broader world dip their toes into cryptocurrency. And I think it's going to be really important what narrative develops there, how that ends up, how people end up seeing crypto, and how regulators do, but also just how the public does, how institutions do. And I think you're going to see really different, methods of adoption and patterns of adoption depending on that. And I just don't know what the answer is. And I think that a lot of that might be super dependent on a few things. Really just looking at in the end, what do what do people end up what memes end up propagating, right? What do people end up talking to each other about? What do people say? What do people think when they think of Bitcoin, when they think of crypto? And I think that's going to play a pretty big role in just what patterns in general adoption sort of shows. And so anyway, whatever, there's going to be a lot of things that'll happen over the next year. No one knows for sure what's going to be dominant, what's going to matter. But if I had to sort of guess right now at which patterns, and sort of which lines are going to end up having a really big lasting impact on the industry, I think those are some things that I would point to. And I think those are things which are going to matter quite a bit. And where we don't know the answer yet. We don't know what the world's going to decide. But what it does decide could shape the industry for decades to come. All of that being said, I mean, no one was even paying attention to crypto, 8 years ago, really. And certainly very few people, saw crypto for what it was 8 years ago and then nailed what it was going to be today and what it looked like it might be tomorrow. This industry changes at such a rapid pace compared to most. It innovates so quickly. It builds new things so quickly. And it builds new narratives so quickly. that it's just really hard to, in any sort of reasonable generalized sense, really answer the question of like, uh, what will happen in the industry. I think no one knows is just the right answer. And anyone who has an answer that's confident and not that is sort of full of shit. And that's just the overarching theme here is, uh, you know, what happens tomorrow depends on what we do today. And
Yeah.
we can't know that ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, at least together tonight we witnessed the Bitcoin reach to the all-time high, right? So,
Yep.
yeah, it's a good sign. I mean, a new milestone. Let's see.
Yep.
It's hard to tell what's going on, in the future. Even I think from your perspective, I mean, you understand the trading, you understand DeFi well. I mean, you support lots of good projects, but still, it's hard to predict, right? So, just rapidly
Yeah.
changing a lot. So, let's just stay positive. I mean, right? So it really depends on
Totally.
what we are doing right now. So it's deliver the result for tomorrow, right? So
Yep.
we should line up. Thank you.